Good evening, I'm Kathy Lewis, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation on behalf of Old Dominion University. This is part of our University Presents lecture series. We are so thrilled to welcome one of America's leading climate scientists. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is here tonight to give us hope, nothing less than that. Hope. She is the bringer of good news about innovative solutions to climate change that are coming from places where you'd least expect them. Dr. Hayhoe is very active on Twitter, so you can follow her at Hayhoe, Hayhoe. She is a professor of political science at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, and she says the most important thing we all can do to fight climate change is simply to talk about it. Which is great because we're all so traumatized by talking about politics for the last many months. It'll give us something else to talk about at the Thanksgiving table. Fear not if you're worried about that conversation. It'll be much smaller this year. Dr. Hayhoe has some great strategies for us to engage with those we love around this issue that she calls global weirding. Now, tonight's conversation is designed to be highly interactive. Dr. Hayhoe will walk you through how to do that in the course of our presentation. For now, though, will you join me in extending a very warm virtual welcome to a Red Raider of Texas Tech, a TED Talk superstar, and my #1 phone a friend if I ever get on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. I would love to be your phone a friend. My commission is only 50%.
Perfect. We'll do it.
I am so happy to be able to speak to you virtually tonight. Coronavirus has thrown all of our plans into disarray, whether it's family gatherings, weddings, funerals, classes, jobs, schooling, but at least we're able to still connect this way. And you can see me talking to you. I can't see you, but I am going to be asking you some questions and getting you to answer those too. So you'll have a chance to get your say in as well. We're going to be talking specifically about forecasting our future. What do we expect when we look to the future? Let me share my screen with you. And here we go. So the way that we are going to be interacting with each other tonight is through something called Poll Everywhere. It's very easy. Just get your phone. If you have your phone in your hand, take your phone or take your computer that you're on or your iPad or your tablet or whatever you're using and go to pollev.com/myname, which is Katharine. It has 2 A's in it. That can be a little difficult, so just make sure you spell it right. pollev.com/Katharine. And when you go there, you will be asked, what is your name? And you can just push skip on that. We don't collect names. But then you're going to see a question. And the question is going to be, which best describes you? Are you a student, faculty and staff, an ODU alum, a member of the community of Hampton Roads, Chesapeake, Norfolk, Hampton Roads or beyond, or just interested? Because this is on the internet, so anybody can attend. All right, it looks like the students were quickest off the mark with this. We've got 59% students. Oh, 58, it's falling a little bit. Faculty and staff, the alumni and community members are coming up a little bit. It might take those of us who are older a little bit longer to find the right place on our phones, so the student numbers are shrinking. Okay, it looks like we're about half students now, about half other. All right, this is how we're going to do it. Now you know how it works. Okay, so I'm talking about extremes. And wherever we live, we are vulnerable to weather and climate extremes. This is a map showing the number of weather and climate disasters that have caused at least $1 billion in damage since 1980. And I live in Texas. Texas has seen the greatest number. They've seen over 100 events that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage, some of them much more than that, since 1980. In fact, where I live, the weather is so extreme that we get pretty much every type of thing you can imagine. We get hurricanes and droughts. We get floods. We get ice storms and blizzards. We get dust storms so big they have a special name, haboobs. That is indeed a haboob taken very close to where I live, a picture of a haboob. And when a number of years ago, this was 8 years ago, the Weather Channel had a competition for the craziest, toughest, wildest weather in the United States. And the city where I live in, Lubbock, Texas, went up head to head against Fairbanks, Alaska, Fargo, North Dakota, and Caribou, Maine, which I had never heard of before, but just from the name Caribou, Maine, you know it's got to be a tough place. And Lubbock, Texas won. So if anybody knows crazy weather, we do. But lest our heads be too swollen, the same year there was another competition. And that competition was run by a Realtors Association. And Lubbock, Texas also won that competition. But you know what that one was? Most boring city in America competition. Yes. Now I know that Norfolk is not boring. Norfolk, obviously, you have the beach just down the road. You have the USS Wisconsin. You have Mount Trashmore. And you have the Grilled Cheese Bistro. Yes, one of my favorite places. It's a good thing I don't live there because I'd probably be there every week. So Norfolk does not suffer from the same problem of being boring, but you also are subject to many expensive weather and climate disasters. Virginia as a whole is one of the darker red states. It's the same color as North Carolina, and it is a lot darker than Maryland, than Pennsylvania, or and about the same color as Georgia. So what happens in Virginia? A lot. There's storms, there's flooding, there's heat waves, there's hurricanes. Wherever we live, we're always at risk from rolling a double six. What's a double six? A double six is that crazy weather event, the heavy rain event, the storm, the ice storm, the heat wave, the hurricane. That's just a natural part of weather on planet Earth. Weather is sort of like a tree. It's what happens in a certain place at a certain time. So weather is a hot day or week or even an unusually warm or cold year. And here's the thing. Our brains are built to remember weather. They are. Our brains are really good at remembering weather, and I'll prove it to you. Everybody has a weather story. Here's your next question. Now, you have to answer this question with a word. And if you have to use more than one word, you need to put a dot between the words. You'll see why as soon as people start answering. So if you're going to say Hurricane Irene, you have to say Hurricane Irene, please. Okay? When I ask people, do you have a memorable weather event? We all do. We can all think of a memorable weather event that we've lived through, right? Oh, it took people a while to get started, but now we got the answers coming quickly. Okay, that wasn't too hard, was it? So we've got people who've lived through tornadoes, who've lived through different hurricanes, people who've lived through lots of different hurricanes, blizzards, ice storms, flooding, more floods. Everybody has a weather story, don't they? And living in Lubbock, Texas, I have a new weather story every year, I feel like. We all have a weather story. Ooh, I like that. That's technical, adiabatic wind event. Nice. Everybody has a weather event because that's what our brains are built to remember. Here's the thing though. Climate is like the forest. Climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. Our brains are not built to remember climate. In order to remember climate, we would have to remember the temperature and rainfall and humidity and cloudiness on every single day of the year for at least 20 to 30 years. And we have to be able to somehow add that up in our heads and fit a trend line to it to see if it was changing. Climate is not what our brains are built to remember. We have some fuzzy idea about it. But, you know, we grew up being told that our grandparents walked 2 miles in 6-foot snow uphill both ways to school. And they probably are remembering one day when they did walk, it wasn't uphill both ways, but they did walk 6 feet, you know, in 6 feet of snow to school. But it certainly didn't happen all the time. So climate, our brains are not built to remember. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have a quiz. Now you may be saying, hang on, I didn't sign up for a quiz. Don't worry, there will be no grading. This is a self-grading quiz. But I want you to kind of just jot down to yourself, just to yourself on a piece of paper or in your head, jot down to yourself what you think the answers to these 4 questions are. And if you are not in Norfolk, I am sorry. You're just going to have to take a wild guess for Norfolk. You can guess for where you live if you want to too, but we are talking specifically about Norfolk here. So wild guess. Norfolk's long-term average annual temperature is what? Norfolk's annual temperature has changed by how much over the last 100 years? The most recent year where Norfolk's average temperature was above average was what year? And the most recent year when Norfolk's temperature was below the long-term average was, all right, just scribble down some answers to yourself. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you what you said. Now we're going to look at the real answers. Ready? So first of all, Norfolk's long-term average annual temperature is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But over the last 100 years, it has changed by 0.2 degrees per decade, or in other words, 2 degrees Fahrenheit over 100 years. What was the most recent year with temperatures above average? Last year, and the year before that, the year before that, the year before that, and probably this year too. What was the most recent year with below average temperatures? Oh my goodness, that was 1996, 24 years ago. Isn't that crazy? So now I'm going to ask you, and your answer here is totally anonymous. So that means that you could lie if you want to, but I'm going to ask you to try to be honest. On the 4 questions I asked you, did you get them all right? Were you sort of in the ballpark? Were you maybe close on one of them? Or I see your point. Okay. All right. So we have 5% of people whose brains do apparently understand climate. 4%, okay, it's decreasing slightly, all right. We've got most people who are sort of in the ballpark, that's good. And then we've got a very honest 20% and an even more honest 15% who are like, you know what, I didn't even get there. All right, you see what I mean here? Climate is not what our brains are built to remember. But it turns out that although we remember the hot and the cold, the wet and the dry, that's what we remember, our society is built on climate. Our society is built on the assumption that the long-term average of weather is stable. Not only that, but we assume that the highs and the lows we've seen in the past are a perfect predictor of the future. So what aspects of our society are built on climate? Almost everything. Our residential and commercial building codes, what type of crops we grow where and when and how big of an air conditioning unit or furnace we need, an insulation for our buildings, where the 100-year and 1,000-year flood zones are, whether you need snow removal equipment or not, what your water plan is, your energy plan. Heck, even the clothes in your closet are a function of climate, not weather. I have a Canada Goose jacket because I'm from Canada. I brought it all the way to Texas with me. It required its own box because it's that big. And now it just hangs there. And once a year when it snows, I put it on just out of principle. But there's really no reason to have a down-filled jacket in Texas. So these assumptions determine all aspects of our society that in turn affect our economy. And here's the thing. If we take the past as a guide to the future, it's like driving down the road, looking in the rear view mirror. And there is a circumstance under which that could keep you on the road. When the road is dead straight. If the road is dead straight and you're driving down the road looking in the rear view mirror, you will stay on the road. And this is pretty much the history of human civilization on this planet. There have been some regional ups and downs that have affected the Mayan civilization in Mexico. They've affected civilizations in the Middle East as well. But those were just regional fluctuations. Over the course of human civilization on this planet, which is not that old, 6,000 to 8,000 years, maybe 10,000 years at most, the temperature of the planet has been as stable as the temperature of the human body. Your human body temperature goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree a day, but overall, it's pretty stable. So planning for the future based on the past, looking in the rearview mirror, has worked really well for us, really well in planning for our food, our building codes, our economy, our water resources. But what happens if climate is changing? We still have hot and cold, we still have wet and dry, but our long-term average is changing. And not only that, but look very carefully, don't blink, our extremes are changing too. When there's a curve in the road, we have to look ahead. We can't just look behind us. And this is where we find ourselves today. There is a curve on the road, and in fact, our wheels are already on the rumble strip. How? Well, how is climate changing? We see long-term trends, that line is tilting, but we also see changing extremes. Our variability is often getting stretched. And how that affects us depends on where we live. If you live in North Dakota, you don't worry about hurricanes, right? If you live in the middle of the desert, you don't worry about wildfires. How climate change is affecting us is by taking the things we already worry about and making many of them worse. Now, I'm going to go through and give you some examples of what's happening and how it's affecting us here in the US and specifically in Virginia and Norfolk. A lot of what I'm going to tell you comes from the National Climate Assessment. So if you want any more information, just take a quick screenshot, or if you have your phone out, you can take a quick picture of this, because there's a chapter here for every part of the US. There's a chapter here for every sector, like transportation and health and water and things. And it's a great resource if you want more information. But it is 1,600 pages long. So I'm going to be giving you the summary of what you need to know in about 10 minutes. You're welcome. All right, let's start with temperature. Here's where we left off with Norfolk. Norfolk temperature has increased 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. The entire United States, this is the lower 48 states, the lower 48 states has increased by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. But when people see a heat wave, they say, oh, this heat wave must be global warming. And then you know what happens. Then they say, oh, there's a cold wave. Where's global warming now? Remember, tree, forest. We have to look at the long-term average over multiple decades. And when we look at heat waves, for example, we have to know how all the heat waves are changing. And this is what we see. This is really interesting. We see that our heat extremes are getting longer and stronger and more frequent, but we still break cold temperature records too. So this figure shows the ratio between the number of high temperature records and the number of low temperature records broken each year. So each year we break hundreds of high temperature records, and each year we break hundreds of low temperature records. But for example, a couple of years ago, I think the ratio was 3 to 1. We broke 10,000 cold temperature records in the US that year, 10,000. You might say, wow, that's a lot. But we broke 35,000 high temperature records. So that's the difference between climate and weather. If you're just living through one of the cold records, you might say, oh, well, where is global warming now? But if we look at the long-term statistics, we can say, wow, from year to year, the numbers go up and down, but decade by decade by decade, we're breaking a lot more high temperature extremes. And we are seeing this everywhere. This past summer, Death Valley set the record for the planet's hottest temperature in years. This July was the hottest July on record for Norfolk itself. The Norfolk Naval Base is worried about exposure to extreme heat, and they're taking new measures to make sure that people stay safe when they're working on the naval base during extreme heat. I was actually in Norfolk a couple of years ago when there was a heat wave that was so extreme it actually melted a road. Do you remember that? That was a few years ago. So what's happening in terms of the dice metaphor? So again, wherever we live, we always have a chance of rolling a double six. And frankly, if we live in Texas, we already have 3 6s on our dice because Texas gets everything. But as climate changes, it's like it's sneaking in decade after decade, and it's taking one and then another of these numbers and turning them into 6s too, and even 7s. So all of a sudden we're rolling a lot more double 6s and even the occasional double 7. And we're saying, how did this happen? It's kind of like a baseball player on steroids. He always had a chance of hitting a home run because he was a pretty good baseball player. But once he started taking the steroids, he started hitting a lot more home runs. Another way to think about this is how the military describes climate change. The Department of Defense describes it as a threat multiplier. And personally, I think this is the single best description I've ever heard. A threat multiplier doesn't create a threat. It takes a threat that already exists and it amplifies it or makes it worse. And that is exactly what is happening with climate change. So when we see something happen, like a wildfire, a hurricane, a flood, or a heat wave, the question is not, did climate change cause this event? Because we always get heat waves, we always get hurricanes, we always get. The question is, did climate change make it worse? And if so, by how much? That's the question. And this is at the cutting edge of science because we're starting to be able to answer this question. There's an organization run by scientists called the World Weather Attribution, and they actually look at specific events and they can say how much more likely that event was or how much stronger that event was because of a changing climate. And one of their top scientists, a woman called Federici Otto, she just wrote this amazing book, and I just read it recently. It came out 3 weeks ago. It's called Angry Weather. If you have a camera, take a little picture or take a screenshot right now, because this book is fantastic. Don't worry, it is not a technical book. It is not a book for scientists. It's a book explaining how we scientists can actually put some numbers on how much worse climate change is making our extreme weather. So you'll be fascinated by it. Check out that book. I strongly recommend it. But let me continue by talking about some other things besides heat. Let's talk about sea level rise, right? We know that sea level rise is occurring exponentially. It is rising now twice as fast as when satellite records began in the 1990s. The main reason why it's rising faster and faster is because of the melting of land-based ice like Greenland and Antarctica and glaciers. And we know that Greenland is melting 6 times faster than it was. So sea level is not only rising, but it's rising faster. Why do we care about it? We care about it because we always have high tides, right? High tides are normal. That's just what happens. Sometimes you get a king tide. But when you have a high tide, or even worse, a king tide, with sea level rise on it as a threat multiplier, that's when you start to get the crazy pictures like this. An extraordinary rise in US coastal flooding, mostly across the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast. In Miami, they are literally building up the level of some of their streets by 2 feet to keep them above the rising tides. In the Carolinas, beachfront properties have already decreased by $1.6 billion. And in Florida, properties at risk from flooding are already selling a lot less quickly. In Florida, they're looking at potential 15% loss in the values. And of course, in Norfolk, we've got the naval shipyard. Rising seas directly threaten it. And many naval leaders, many admirals are speaking out about these risks. You may be familiar with, and if you're not, I strongly encourage you to look up a tool called Surging Seas. What it does is it shows where all the low elevation areas are, and you can zoom in so you can actually see the streets here. You can see ODU is right basically in the middle of the screen there. It shows what places are most at risk as sea levels rise. And you can zoom in on any area around the whole US, and you can even enter your location here. For Norfolk specifically, this is looking at the water level station that's 5 miles away. For Norfolk specifically, the risk of at least 1 flood per year is going up exponentially to where by the time we get past about 2070, there's definitely going to be at least 1 a year. And this figure really shows that loading the dice thing that I was talking about, right? I was talking about how climate change is loading the dice, how you always have a chance of rolling a double 6 naturally. That's the blue. But as climate change is sneaking in and changing some of those other numbers, you roll more double 6s, that's the orange. So would you have had coastal flood days anyways? Yes. But as sea level rises, it's increasing the risk. In fact, it is doubling the risk of the flood days in Norfolk. This is specifically for the Norfolk area. What else is happening? Because I'm not done yet. What else is happening is that we see that heavy precipitation is increasing. Now, I'm not saying precipitation here to be all sciencey, because when it's below freezing, it falls as snow. Is heavy snowfall increasing? Yes, it actually is. Because overall, temperatures across the whole US have warmed by what? 1.5 degrees. Is it still cold enough to snow in many places? Yes, not necessarily Southern Virginia, but Northern Virginia, it definitely snows, right? Maybe even still a little bit in Norfolk. But we have more days when there's more water vapor in the atmosphere. So warmer air, even if it's below freezing, warmer air holds more water vapor. And when a storm comes along today, there's more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And so even in the DC area, you know, they have Snowmageddon and all the big snowstorms the last few years. Those snowstorms would have happened naturally anyways, but there was more snow, and there's a lot more rain too when we have storms when it's not cold. There's a lot more rain now than 50 or 100 years ago because there's more water vapor sitting up there for a storm to sweep up and dump on us. And in fact, we've seen some pretty big increases since the 1950s already. And of course, this affects Norfolk. Virginia Beach neighborhood flood from heavy rainfall. This is just from 4 weeks ago, right? It's hard to think back to last spring, a year ago last spring, but in spring 2019, the Midwest was under disaster declarations in many places in Nebraska and beyond due to heavy flooding, which was enhanced or exacerbated or multiplied by climate change. And then we've got hurricanes. Now, let me just be clear. Some years we have a lot of hurricanes, like this year. Other years we don't have very many, like last year. Overall, the total number of hurricanes hasn't really changed. But hurricanes themselves are changing. How? Well, they're powered by warm ocean water, and the oceans are warming too. In fact, 90% of the heat that's being trapped inside the climate system by this blanket we're wrapping around our planet, a blanket made up of heat-trapping gases from digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, 90% of that heat is going into the oceans. So the warming that Norfolk has seen, the 2-degree warming over the last 100 years, that's just due to the 10% of heat that's going into the atmosphere. 90% is going into the oceans. And that heat is powering stronger hurricanes that intensify faster, that are bigger, that are stronger and slower, and they have a lot more rain associated with them. Remember that book I recommended called Angry Weather? It talks about how scientists can actually start to put some numbers on this. And for Hurricane Harvey, which is one of the most devastating, expensive events in US history, weather and climate events, that is, it's estimated that about 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have occurred if the same hurricane had happened 100 years ago. Could Harvey have happened 100 years ago? Of course it could have. There's been hurricanes hitting the Houston area for as long as people have been there. But they didn't drop 50 inches of rain, did they? So because of this, scientists are even starting to be able to put dollar signs on this. So if Hurricane Harvey, they now estimate that it cost well over $180 billion. It's estimated that climate change was responsible for about $67 billion of that. That's a lot of money. And then there's this. If you've been watching the news the last few weeks, you have seen these pictures. Orange apocalyptic skies in the Western United States. Now again, do they get wildfires in the Western US? Of course they do. It's part of the natural ecosystem. Should they be managing their forests better? They probably could do more forest management if they had a bigger budget. Not raking, that does not work out there, but more controlled burns. But even with that, they've got the threat multiplier, which is what? Climate change. And how is climate change multiplying wildfires? It's not making them more frequent, because most wildfires in the lower 48 states are human ignition, not arson, Only 7% of the big California fires are arson, which means deliberate. Most of them are accidental. Like what? Like dropping a load of burning trash into the dry brush. Yeah, that really happened. Like having an old appliance plugged into your shed that shorted out, burned down the garage, and started a massive wildfire. That happened too. Like having poorly insulated power lines that sparked and started a wildfire. That happened too. Like letting off fireworks at your gender reveal party. Yes, that started the fire too. So the number of fires is not changing, but you know what is changing? How much they burn. Why? Well, imagine if you drop a match on a pile of green wood, what happens? Not much. Now imagine if you drop that same match, or another match from the same box, if you want to be technical. Imagine you drop another match on a pile of bone dry kindling. What happens? A conflagration happens with sparks and flames. That's what climate change does. It dries out the vegetation. So when that fire ignites, it burns much greater area, much quicker, and much more intensely. How bad is it? Let me show you. This is from California Fire Agency. These are the top 20 largest fires since records began in 1932. You'll notice that only 3 of the top 20 biggest fires happened before the year 2000. Only 3. Then all the blue ones happened from 2000 to 2019. And then all the red ones, including the giant August complex that smashed the record for the largest wildfire on record, they all happened in 1 year, 2020. We know, and this is from the National Climate Assessment, we know that without climate change, wildfires would have burned a total of 11 million acres since 1980 across the Western US. That's the light yellow area. But with a changing climate loading the dice, it's burned over double that. That's the orange area. And it's not just the Western US. Alaska, where most wildfires are ignited by lightning, has experienced its worst season last year. The most expensive disaster in all of Canadian history was a wildfire a few years ago. And think back to January, this January. What were the headlines this January? Australia, the Australian bushfires, which are also getting worse because of climate change. It's gotten to the point now where, as the Prime Minister of Dominica said, his island was wiped out by one of the supersized hurricanes 3 years ago. He said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. So if that's the case, why are we not treating this thing like a 5-alarm fire or a hurricane bearing down on us today? There's a reason why. And it has nothing to do with the science I've showed you. It has everything to do with what's up here. The Yale program on climate communication asks people across the whole US, what do you think about different things related to climate change? And these are showing results by county, or obviously by city for Virginia. And anywhere that's orange means that more than 50% of people said yes. And the darker orange, the more people said yes. If it's less than 50%, it's blue. So across the whole country, 72% of people would say that global warming is happening, and 77% in Norfolk would say that. You can go here and look up the numbers later if you want. If you just Google Yale climate opinion maps, this will pop right up, and you can look by congressional district as well as by county. Then they say, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Yes. Do you think it will harm future generations? Yes. So most people say it's real. It will harm plants and animals, and it will harm future generations. Will it harm people in developing countries, people who live far away? Well, now we're on people, and we're on people today, so the numbers are going down a bit, right? And then they say, will it harm people in the United States? The numbers go down even farther. We start to see some more blue. But then they ask the kicker, do you think it will harm you? Will it harm you? Only 43% of people across the US say yes. And even in Norfolk, only 50% of people say yes. Only half the people think it will affect us. Why? Well, I think one reason is because the #1 image we see when people talk about global warming is this: an animal that hardly anybody has ever seen in real life. And if it's really just about the polar bears, how about we just, take part of the Northwest Territories and turn it into a seal breeding farm and feed the polar bears so that they can stay alive. I'm Canadian, so I can say that. But because the polar bears are starving, they feed out on the ice. They don't feed on land because they don't catch their prey on land. If this is the only reason we care about climate change, there's other things that we could do to help the polar bears, and we should do it. But the reality is, as the polar bear scientists told me, after the polar bear, we're next. We are the ones on the metaphorical iceberg. We are the ones who are going to be affected by a changing climate. We are the ones. We care about climate change, not just because of the polar bear. It affects us. It affects our water. It affects our food. It affects national security. It affects our economy. It affects our health. Climate change affects us. So I want to ask you now, back to you. I hope you didn't forget. Why do you care about climate change? Answer this question, fill in the blank. If you're going to use more than one word, make sure you use a dot there, right? I care about climate change because it affects what? Good, we got family there. All right. Why do you care about climate change? Because it affects people I love, yes. Because it affects my home, because it affects future generations, everyone, my property, yes. Wildlife, yep. My grandchildren, minorities, it affects my bills. Yes, it affects your bills. This is something, kitchen table issue, how they talk about, this is something that people need to know, that it affects your bills. It affects the future of Earth. It affects, I like that one, me, children, and everyone. Yes, everything. Exactly. It affects everything we already care about. That's why we care about climate change. But many people don't realize that. Many people think that it just affects things and people far away. Like I said, climate change is a threat multiplier. We care about it because it takes the risks that already threaten everything we already care about today, and it makes them worse. Whether we care about diving coral reefs, whether we care about the safety of our home, whether we care about pollution in the air that our children breathe, whether we care about coronavirus, whatever we care about, climate change interacts with and even can exacerbate many of these issues. Specifically, climate change is the result of burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels also produce air pollution. It turns out that if you live in an area with poor air pollution, you are much more likely to get sick from COVID. And if you get COVID, you're much more likely to get much sicker, end up in the hospital, or even die due to air pollution. It's all connected. And it isn't just us. Around the world, climate change has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries by 25%. It is not fair. It takes the people who are already down and it kicks them further down. It takes people who are already marginalized, who are already disadvantaged, who already don't have access to clean water or basic health care, and it makes their lives even worse. When we look around the world, we know that women and children are affected more, especially in developing countries. We know that Indigenous people are affected more. And we know right here at home that communities of color are affected more because they're already in areas that tend to flood more, that have a bigger urban heat island effect. They're subject to stronger heat waves because of that. And they're already exposed to more pollution. So what can we do about it? What can you do about it? Well, interestingly, these maps have the answer. So we left off here. Do you think global warming will harm you personally? 43% of people across the US say yes, and only 50% of people in Norfolk. But this is not the darkest blue map that they have. You know what the darkest blue map is? This one. Do you ever talk about it even just once in a while? Only 38% of people in Norfolk talk about it even once in a while. What's the connection? We talk about what we care about. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? So talking about this is the very first step. Why don't we talk about it? We often don't talk about it because we don't think it matters to us. And we don't talk about it because we don't think there's anything positive or constructive we can do to fix it. We're told that the only things that would fix it would be destroying the economy or taking away people's personal liberties or taking away everybody's cars or, something like that. So what happens is this, a vicious cycle. Climate changes. If we look at what's happening in our neighborhoods, in our city, in the country, around the world, we get worried, as we should be. So what we do is we share more scary information with people. If you're not worried, you should be. And I will give you some horrifying statistics that should make you very scared. Here's where this comes in, though. As humans, when we are confronted with fearful or scary information, we actually tend to reject it and withdraw. As neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, who studies how our brains work, she says, fear and anxiety cause us humans to withdraw, to freeze, to give up, rather than take action. So if we do talk about this, often we're talking about it in the wrong way. We're just doing this huge information dump on people that just leaves people overwhelmed, fearful, and frozen. So climate change is more. How do we break this? We break this cycle by talking about why and how climate change matters to us here, where you live, not up at the poles with the polar bears. And at the exact same time, you have to pair it up like peanut butter and jelly or wine and cheese. At the exact same time, you have to talk about all the positive things that we can do to fix it. You can't talk about a problem without talking about a solution. We have to talk about both of them together at the same time. So climate changes, we get worried, but here's where we break the cycle. As researcher Matthew Goldberg says, who studies communication, he says, climate conversations with friends and family can create a true positive pro-climate feedback loop, where if we share how it affects us and what we can do to fix it, people feel empowered and action results. As neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, she says, our human brain is literally built to associate forward action, both physically forward action as well as mentally forward action, with a reward, not with avoiding harm. So reframe what you say so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. Doesn't that make you feel hopeful? So how do we begin these conversations? I want to just give you a little bit of a template here. We start by talking about something we agree on. Do we both have military experience? Do we both enjoy the same activity? Do we have a shared faith? Are we both parents? Do we both live in the same place? What type of things can we bond over? We can bond over pretty much anything. I can bond with people over a shared love of science, a curiosity for understanding how this world works. I bond with people over the fact that I live in Texas, or I love to ski, or I'm a mom, or I'm a Christian, or I've even bonded with people over the fact that we knit. Yes. So that's where we have to begin our conversations, not with scary facts, not with something we disagree with people on, but with something that we agree on. So now I want to ask you a slightly different question. And this is the last question I'll ask you. And then in a couple of minutes, you'll be able to start asking me questions. So give me a word here. I care about climate change because I am a what? What are you that makes you the perfect person to care about climate change? And I don't want to see everybody giving the same answer here. I want to see different answers because everybody is different. We are all different. And who we are is the perfect person to care about climate change and to talk about that with other people who share who we are, right? Okay, I love this. We've got moms. Yes, moms absolutely care about climate change. We have got scientists who also care, of course. We've got people who love doing things outdoors, snowboarding. I saw surfing last time, soccer. We've got people who are doers or activists, people who are thinkers. I love that, thinkers and doers. We've got people who sail. I sail too. We've got a librarian. We've got somebody who's a caring person. I like that. Somebody who's a human or a Christian or a parent or a grandparent, or yes, whoever you are, even if what you just put is, I'm a dog owner. Whoever you are is the perfect person to care about climate change and the perfect person to talk to other people who are beekeepers or who are artists or who are sailors or who are sentient human beings or who are activists or who are surfers or cooks or coffee lovers. You are the perfect person to talk to those other people who share what you love. I love this too. So we need to talk about how and why it matters to us. Because I am a mom, I care about climate change because it affects my children. Because I live in Norfolk, I care about climate change because it's flooding my home or other people's homes that I know. Because I am a sailor, I care about what's happening in the ocean. Because I'm a beekeeper, I care about the health of bees, and we know they're already being affected by toxins and pollutants in the environment, but climate change is making that worse. Because I am a blank, I care about climate change, and then you would too, because you're also that. But that's only half of it. The other half is, what can we do to fix it? So I love talking about this because people are always surprised. They don't know that, for example, in Texas, we have the first carbon neutral airport in North America, DFW Airport. We have entire towns going green. The city of Houston just announced that it would be meeting the Paris Agreement targets, and Houston is the home to the biggest oil and gas companies in the US. We have the biggest Army base in the US, Fort Hood, and they've been powered 100% by clean energy for the last 2 years, saving taxpayers $150 million. If Fort Hood in Texas can do it, why can't the naval base do it too? Talk about what's happening at Old Dominion University. Here's their sustainability program. They've got sustainable dining, sustainable transportation, recycling, stormwater management, community garden programs. What's happening in the state of Virginia? Well, in the middle of the lockdown in April, the governor signed clean energy legislation to accelerate Virginia's transition to clean energy this past April. What else is happening in Virginia? Well, let's just talk about solar energy. Virginia is 17th in the country out of all the states. There are 4,500 solar jobs. They've got enough solar energy installed to power 123,500 homes. There's 234 solar companies operating in Virginia, and they even have a map of where those are, and there's Norfolk right down there. In fact, you might know somebody who works at one of those. That's pretty cool. When you start asking people other questions, like, do you support requiring utilities to produce 20% of their energy from renewable sources? It turns out 2/3 of the people in Norfolk agree with that. So they might not agree that climate change affects them, only 50% do, but 67% agree that we should be requiring utilities to have more renewable energy. That's a great thing to talk about. I love telling surprising stories of what's happening in industry with Walmart or Apple or Microsoft going with clean energy. I love telling stories about what's happening in faith communities, Catholic communities, evangelical communities, all kinds of communities around the world are reducing their carbon footprint, looking at clean energy, being more sustainable. I love telling surprising stories like the Coal Museum went with solar energy. Or did you know that United Airlines has been flying biofuel flights out of the LA airport for 4 years? Who knew? I love telling stories about what kids are doing or what's happening around the world in places where they don't have access to clean energy, and it's revolutionizing their lives. Organizations like Solar Sisters that are giving women in sub-Saharan Africa jobs so they can support and feed their families, and they can provide battery-powered light for people. Project Drawdown is amazing. If you haven't checked out Project Drawdown, this is another one to take a screenshot of or a picture, because they have over 100 different climate solutions, some of which you're like, oh yeah, of course, I know about that. But others you might be like, oh, coastal wetland protection? How is that a climate solution? Or education of women and girls, or more efficient ocean shipping, or conservation agriculture? Let me learn more about that so I could share this with people when I'm talking to them. So this is why when they asked me to do a TED Talk, I said, I want to do a TED Talk about the most important thing that any one person can do about climate change. And they're like, well, we already have one about light bulbs and vegan diets and electric cars. And I said, no, I don't want to talk about those. I want to talk about the thing that nobody's doing and the thing that if we all did it, it would make a huge difference. Talking about climate change. And now what you just got was not my TED Talk. So go ahead and watch my TED Talk and you get a whole different, how do we actually do this? But let me end with just one story. 5 months after this TED Talk came out, I was giving a talk at the London School of Economics. After I was finished, an older man came up to me and said, I just want to let you know that I watched your TED Talk 5 months ago, and I've been having conversations with people in my town. About 150, 160,000 people lived in this town. I've been having conversations with people ever since. And I've been keeping a record of all the people who've had conversations in my town about climate change. Would you like to see it? I said, yeah, of course. So he reaches in his leather satchel and he pulls out, and I was expecting, maybe 70 or 80 names. He pulls out a stack of papers with 10,000 names on them. They had had 10,000 conversations in his town over the last 5 months. And he said, because of that, our city council just voted to declare a climate emergency, which is what they do in the UK. It's kind of like a climate action plan to then make the city look at how it can reduce its emissions and how it can prepare for the impacts of a changing climate. And I checked in with him and he said, well, now we're up to 11,800 conversations. That is the power of a conversation. It starts it like a row of dominoes. A conversation pushes over the first domino. And it is something that every single person can do. Because the science shows the number one best person to have that conversation is not me, it's you. Friends and family are the most effective people to talk about this. So with climate change, we know that people aren't hearing enough about it, but overloading them with doom and gloom just paralyzes them. Instead, and guilt-based solutions just turn people off. Nobody likes a bony finger of judgment getting waved at them. Instead, sharing locally relevant impacts and constructive solutions with short-term benefits too has the greatest impact because people want to hear more about that. And that spurs conversation. And those conversations really do make a difference. Every single one of us can do this. Thank you. Now we're going to be taking your questions, and here's how we're going to do them. You go to polev.com and you enter your question. You can enter any question you want. You don't have to put dots or dashes in there or anything weird. And here's the fun part. You can upvote the questions because we have a lot of people on this Zoom, and Kathy and I are not going to be able to get to all of your questions. So even if you don't have a question, I want you to go here and I want you to upvote the questions that you most want answered, and we will get to the top questions and answer those questions. So now let me bring on Kathy, who is going to chair this question session. Kathy, take it away.
What a great talk. The only thing I regret about this format is that you cannot hear the thunderous applause that is happening all over the globe right at this very minute. Am I right, friends? We're all spontaneously applauding. That's a beautiful thing. So I do a little radio talk show, and this is political season, sort of referenced that earlier. I know it's a shock. We have an election on November 3rd. I know that some of you have been asleep. It's coming up November 3rd. Mm-hmm. And I asked a congressional candidate a question. We talked to all the candidates before, and I made this idea about 2 years ago that I was going to start asking them about climate change. I didn't really know what I was going to ask them, but we're just going to, kind of close it out there and see what it. And it's been interesting because in the last couple of years, more and more of them are addressing climate change in their, in their programs and whatnot. And so I asked this congressional candidate about climate change. And he said, we really cannot afford to talk about climate change right now. We are in the middle of a pandemic. People need jobs. That's the most important thing. And I understand that, but he said, I just don't feel like this is the time to be talking about climate change. And I wonder how you respond. We're all humans with a hierarchy of need. How do you respond when you hear people sort of position that in a relative way?
Well, what I would do, and first of all, that's a very good question and response. I would first of all focus in on what I agree with him on. I agree. People are hurting and people need jobs. We are in devastating circumstances where the gap between the haves and the have-nots, even in the US alone, let alone around the world, is increasing. So I would agree with him wholeheartedly that we need jobs. But then I would segue and I would say, but did you know that the fastest growing jobs in the entire United States, not just last year, not just the year before, but for the last 5 years, has been either in the solar or the wind energy sector? We have more jobs in solar energy now across the country than in the entire coal industry, and almost as many jobs as in the whole fossil fuel industry alone.
Wow.
And so I would say, I would give him some very concrete examples of places where those jobs have really taken off and they've been able to help people to retrain people to have new skills, to get new jobs. And also, a little competition never hurts. I would give some examples of some other places that are taking off on green jobs, and we're in serious danger of being left behind. So do you know the country in the world that has the most green jobs right now is India,
Really?
not the US.
Wow.
And in the US, more green jobs are in places like Texas, for example. Texas is number one in wind, and California. Well, shouldn't Virginia be catching up with them? We don't want them to take over that whole sector and leave us behind. So just kind of pivoting the conversation to show that, you know what, there are real jobs in this sector and we have a real opportunity. It's not a penalty, it's an opportunity to get out ahead. But then I think I would also talk about how climate change is a threat multiplier, how it's actually threatening jobs in the shipyard here. It is threatening the security of people's homes. You don't care about it later. We care about it because we care about our income. We care about our bills, like somebody said. We care about our homes here and now. We care about it because of everything we already care about today.
That is such a great answer. Why did I not have that? I did not have that answer, but I will the next time. Thank you for that. That's a tremendous answer because it gets to just what you were saying, gets to the things we agree on, gets to the things that we mutually care deeply about, and offers some new information that someone might not have had before. And I'll tell you how people respond to that kind of answer, which I think is very generously posed, will also tell you a lot about them too. And that gets to another point that you've made recently, which is who you can talk to this about and who you really, you kind of just got to let go and can't. And I think this congressional candidate I was talking about was not in that latter category. A very, reasonable, nice person. And if I'd have had that answer, we could have probably talked for another half an hour. The questions are coming in, which is great. One of the ones that is really being upvoted now has to do with how those of us who aren't scientists, how we talk about this, bringing in the humanities, bringing in music and art and theater to help tell the story of climate change. And I find it very interesting that you're in the political science department. That's fascinating.
Well, I love this question because we scientists are often the worst communicators about this because we bond with people over science. That's who we are. We're scientists. We bond with people over science. And so we just talk science, science, science. But what we need to do is we need to connect with people's hearts. And to do that, we need to tell stories. We need to communicate in different ways that really help people visualize and understand and react emotionally to this, not just like a kind of a brain in a jar, so to speak. So I think, in my opinion, when it comes to communication, non-scientists are vital. In fact, they may be even more important than scientists because we've known for over 100 years that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the impacts are serious. And now we need everybody else to help us show why and how it matters. So we have musicians who are turning climate data into musical pieces. We have artists who are representing climate change visually and graphically. We have people who are knitting blankets where every stripe is a year, and it's showing how you get redder and redder and redder over time. We have people who are creating stories, and studies have shown that when we are embedded in a story or a movie or a documentary, it actually transports us to that place, and it's more effective at changing our minds than if somebody just handed us the data. So this person said a large abyss often exists. I'm so sad that abyss exists. At my university, we have a climate center. We have 56 faculty who are members of our center, and they come from every single college and almost every department, including English, art, music, psychology, engineering, political science, architecture, medicine, law, because we need all hands on deck here. It is not just a science issue.
That is such a great point. The other question that is getting a lot of votes has to do with how we talk to our lawmakers about this. And that's a great question because a lot of the change we're talking about could be accelerated if we could make policy changes.
So legislators and politicians are a special type of human. No offense meant, but they're human. So often we kind of forget that they're human. And as I talk about in my TED Talk, and as I started to introduce here, but do please watch the TED Talk because you didn't get it tonight. As I talk about in my TED Talk and here, the place to begin the conversation is with something you agree on. So with your legislators, do a little bit of research. What do they care most about? What are their issues? What are they passionate about? What matters the most to them? What did they campaign on? What bills have they proposed or sponsored? How have they voted on things? And then based on that, you can see, oh, well, they actually care a lot about this and this. I can see how this and this relates to flooding, or this and this relates to health and extreme heat, or this and this relates to, safety during hurricanes. So what you do is you begin the conversation. This is especially important with elected officials, although it works on any human. It's especially important with elected officials because they get so many people complaining to them. It's important to begin the conversation by expressing gratitude. By saying, I know that you have championed this issue, or that you care about this issue, or that you care about the people in your district, or, I know that you care about this and I appreciate it and I want to say thank you. So then you've just bonded over that. And then you say, because you care about this, and I do too, I thought that you might want to know that here's something that affects what you already care about. So in other words, you're not introducing something to them that you don't think they should care about. You're introducing something to them that it is natural for them to care about because of who they are.
That's a great idea. One of the other things that happens, and I can sort of envision this happening as we all think about heading home for Thanksgiving, or what odd ways we're going to be doing that this year. It is really hard sometimes to get people to decouple climate change from politics, because you've experienced that yourself. I wonder about how we go about, because this is such a great question. How do we go about getting people out of that automatic defensive, you're talking about something that I don't think my team cares about, to getting them to talk about the issue itself?
Well, your question actually made me laugh a little bit, because let me just share my my screen here. I actually have a just a second. Yes, here we go. I actually have a webinar I gave last Thanksgiving about how to talk about climate change at Thanksgiving dinner.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So if you just Google my name and Thanksgiving dinner, this will pop right up and you'll be able to watch it.
That'll be great. Yeah. It's a very, very tough thing, because people do get very wedded to their political perspectives. I want to get to this question just because it's just such a great one. I'm a 7th grader. That's not me. This is the questioner. I know you're shocked by that. This 7th grader wants to know what he or she can do. That's such a great question.
It is such a great question that we made an entire global weirding episode to answer it. So I have a YouTube series called Global Weirding, and my favorite episode, hands down, is I'm just a kid, what can I do about it? So I didn't know the answer to that question either. So that's why I decided I would go and try to find the answer. So I went and I looked at what kids are doing. And you know what? Kids are doing way more than adults. Kids are beating the socks off adults. If kids ran the world, we wouldn't have most of these problems. So let me just give you a couple of examples, but I want you to go watch that Global Weirding episode because I think you will like it. So there is an 11-year-old who is attending the scientific conference that I present at for the 2nd time because she has developed a new way to get renewable energy from water. She's 11 years old.
Wow.
There was a 16-year-old who won the Intel Science Fair for growing algae under her bed and turning it into carbon neutral fuel. There are a group of kids who are suing the federal government for their right to their future. There is the Fridays for Future strike that's entirely led by kids. It's not just Greta Thunberg, it's hundreds and thousands of kids all over the world. Some of them as young as, grade 4 or 5 kids. Wow. So there are kids that are working with their cities, who are actually even on planning commissions for their cities and how to prepare their city for climate change. There was a bunch of 7th grade girls actually in Florida, 3 7th grade girls who decided that they wanted to cut the carbon footprint of their school. They had no money. Nobody wanted to give them any money. So they went through and they figured out what they could do. They figured out that they could beg for some white paint, and they got everybody together and they painted the roof white because they're in Florida. So it helped cool the school off. They started talking to teachers about, could you leave the windows open when it's a cool day so we don't have to heat or cool? They talked to the cafeteria about all the food waste, because if food waste were its own country, it would be number 3 after China and the US in terms of annual heat trapping gas emissions.
Wow. Wow.
They cut the carbon emissions of their school by 30% with no money. And they did such a great job, they actually ended up getting some grants and they could do even more. And they were 3 7th grade girls. And then a couple of years ago, I was speaking in Scotland at a church, and it was to adults. But one man didn't have a babysitter for his 9-year-old son. So 9 years old is younger than you if you're in grade 7. So he brought his son along, and his son was like, oh, do I have to go? And his dad's like, just bring a book. You can read a book. So his son came and he listened to the whole thing. He just sat there and listened to the whole thing. And then he went home and he said, Dad, I have to do something. And his dad said, okay. And he said, I'm going to start a club at school because nobody turns out the lights. Nobody puts the right recycling in the right bin. We're going to start a club and we're going to make sure that everybody does what they can to conserve. And he did. And his dad said it changed his school life. He started coming home from school and he's like, Mrs. Hawkins put a bottle in the garbage instead of putting it in the recycling bin. So we told her that she had to take it out and put it there. And it totally changed the way he and his friends engaged with their school. And they were making a real difference to the school as well. So kids, you are amazing. And you are the ones who really can change the world. We're just trying to keep up our part.
Very, very true. We have a lot of folks on the line tonight who want to know what faith groups can do around this issue to encourage the discussion of climate change. And I think I have this right. I think I read that that you've made a connection between climate change and sin. And I was wondering if you could just unpack that a bit, what you mean by that and what faith communities can do to engage this issue, which is about our creation. Let's face it.
Yes. Well, so I'm a Christian myself. My husband's a pastor of a non-denominational evangelical church. And the reason why I'm a climate scientist is because I'm a Christian. I was studying astrophysics in university and I was planning to be an astronomer. But I sort of serendipitously took a class to finish my degree in climate science. And there I learned that climate change is not just an environmental issue. I thought that it was real, but I thought that only environmentalists cared about it, and environmentalists would fix it, and the rest of us would wish them well. But, and this relates sort of to one of the questions somebody's asking here, I learned that climate change is in fact a human issue, that it affects everything we care about. It affects our health. It affects our food. It affects the economy. It affects our security. It affects the stability of our government even. It affects every single one of us, no matter where we fall on the political line. And it affects us in ways that matter to us. And not only that, but I also learned in that class that it affects poor and vulnerable people more than anyone else. And that was where it really got me, because as a Christian, I believe that we are to care for those who are less fortunate than us, that we are to love others, that we're told to care for the poor and the orphans and the widows and people who don't have enough food to eat and don't have water to drink. So I thought to myself, well, how can I not do what I can to help? Because it's such an urgent problem. Surely we'll fix it soon. And then I can go back to being an astronomer. That was 25 years ago. So for me, caring about climate change is who I am, because in the first book, the first chapter of the Bible, it says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this planet. In the last book of the Bible, it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. And then in between Revelations and Genesis, it talks about how God cares for the smallest and most insignificant aspects of nature. Those matter to God. It talks about how, again, we are to be caretakers or stewards or gardeners of this planet, and how we are to love people and care for people, and how we're to be recognized by our love for people. And how can we love people if we are causing something that is increasing the gap between the richest and poorest countries by 25%, that's driving people into poverty? How is that loving people? So to me, it's really part of who I am, caring about climate change. And that's why I'm so delighted that there are incredible organizations that are doing great things. And I want to just highlight a few of them here for people. So get prepared to take some notes, because I'm just going to mention their names. and I want you to look them up. I want you to follow them on social media, because that's a good way you can figure out what they're doing. And I want you to learn about what they're doing. And I'm going to give you examples from across the spectrum. Okay, so first of all, we've got Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. They've got 20,000 young people across the US at almost every college and university you can imagine who are advocating for climate solutions. That's amazing. You've also got the Evangelical Environmental Network, which is an organization of evangelicals around the country who care about climate change. You've got the World Evangelical Alliance, which is an international organization representing 600 million evangelicals that is planning to put solar on 1 out of every 5 of their facilities in the next 5 years. And they're also developing curriculum and discipleship information and training and resources. Then you've got Interfaith Power and Light. They are an interfaith organization across the US that have sermon outlines, that have resources, that have assistance programs for increasing the efficiency, saving energy, saving money, reducing your carbon. Then you've got Colby May, who runs a program called RELIT, LIT, and he has a grant right now to help 50 Illinois churches do an energy audit, reduce their energy use, reduce their bills, reduce their carbon emissions, and save money at the same time. Then you've got, of course, the Pope, and you've got the Catholic Climate Covenant here in the US. Then you've got Green Muslims, which is an organization of people who are Muslims who also work with Muslim congregations. Then you've got, let's see. I mean, you're getting the point. I've already gone through like 10 organizations here.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yes. There's so many amazing things that are happening, and they are happening in churches. And it is just really incredible to see this. And so with the church, what can you do? Number one, you can talk about it. You can talk about it in groups. You can talk about it individually. You can talk about it with leadership. You can host a small group. You can create a creation care team. You can do an energy audit of your facility to save money. You can contact local organizations and say, hey, we'd like to have a table. Could you bring in like your LED light bulbs and show us? Or could you lend us an EV to put in the parking lot so people could see what those look like? Or could you, make sure we have like a bike rack so people can bike, or resources if people want to do a community garden. All of those are amazing, but then you can also look at supporting organizations like Tear Fund. Tear Fund works with the poorest people in the world in some of the least developed countries in the world, and it alleviates poverty and hunger and lack of access to clean water, but they understand that climate change is a threat multiplier. Another great organization is AROCHA, AROCHA. I know, there's a difficult name. It means the rock in Portuguese. But AROCHA is international. It's in the US and Canada as well as around the world, and they work to restore ecosystems and build resilience to climate change and involve people in doing that. So Tear Fund and AROCHA are two of my favorite international organizations, and Plant with Purpose is probably a third, another faith-based organization that works in Haiti and a lot of other poor countries to plant trees, restore ecosystems, and help people build jobs. So as you can see, I'm very enthusiastic about that.
Yeah, that's a great list. And we had lots of folks who wanted to know about that tonight. It has been such a joy to talk with you. Someone asked in the chat questions, what keeps you hopeful? I think this whole talk and all of your answers sort of expressed the answer to that question. So I appreciate the question, and I think you've probably already heard the answer. By the way, if you are interested in Dr. Hayhoe's book, and why would you not? There are 2 of them that they have at the ODU bookstore, where they have a lot of other cool stuff too, by the way. All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And this one I love, Climate Courage, How Tackling Climate Change Can Build Communities, Transform the Economy, and Bridge the Political Divide in America. And if we could do all 3 of those things, that would be pretty fantastic. So there are the books right there. You can head on over to the ODU bookstore. Dr. Hayhoe, wow, what a pleasure it's been to talk with you. Follow Dr. Hayhoe on Twitter, if you will. She has a really fine Twitter feed. But thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. This has been absolutely wonderful. And what gives me hope is all of the amazing things people are doing. So if you feel discouraged, look up what an organization is doing, what people are doing. Go out and look for that good news. It won't find you, but if you go looking, you can find it. And then what do you do with that? You share it. Talk about it.
I think we can all do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you who tuned in tonight, and stay tuned for an additional presentation from ODU Presents. We have these conversations quite often throughout the year. This has definitely been one of the best. Thanks for being with us. Good night.